What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to The Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insight. My name is Reese, a very warm welcome to you, and in today's video we're going to take a look at how the results from the Dutch Grand Prix have impacted the Fantasy Drivers' Championship, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the return of the GOAT. And no, I am not talking about Goat Tiffy. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company PlayOn that sponsors the game. If it's not already obvious from my spreadsheet, I'm a bit of a data nerd and Formula One is my passion, so I figured why not try and build a community of other like-minded people here on YouTube. If that sounds good to you, stay tuned to the channel for all sorts of awesome fantasy content, and now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into the video. Okay, so we'll start with the race classification. Same as last week, on the left we have the actual race results and the driver's scores, and then on the right we have the fantasy race result and the driver's respective scores. No surprises at the top, Max is P1 and George is P2. Max has now won the last 4 races in real life, and although we had 4 seconds separating them on track, we only had 1 single point separating Max and George in the fantasy classification. In real life we then had Charles in P3 and Lewis in P4. But in fantasy, we have 2-time world champion Fernando Alonso claiming the final spot on the podium, and then we have the Tifosi's favourite son, Charles Leclerc, in P4. P5 and P6 went to Sergio and Fernando in real life. In fantasy, we have Lewis and Esteban. I did think for a minute there we might see Sir Lewis climb onto the top spot for the first time this year. But after what felt like a very strange set of calls from the Mercedes garage, we basically had a less dramatic repeat of Abu Dhabi, with Max leaving Lewis in his dust on the safety car restart. I was really interested listening to Toto's comments after the race when he was interviewed by Simon Lazenby and Paul di Resta on Sky Sports, because honestly I was so confused watching it in real time, but hearing Toto talk about going for the win with Lewis and how they had 2 choices, pit Lewis and lose track position against Verstappen and then leave George out there to get screwed, or pit both and then they're both screwed. But apparently you can do a third option, which is essentially the reverse of the first option, and somehow that gives Lewis a chance to win the race. It was very interesting to see. I have a theory where Mercedes have been so dominant for the last 8 years that any mistake they might have made on the strategy or in the pits has essentially been nullified by brute force on the track. But now that their car isn't as competitive, we're kind of seeing the F1 equivalent of DJ Khaled's 7th studio album suffering from success play out week after week. The signs are there. If you think back to the 2021 Hungarian Grand Prix, when Lewis lined up on the grid all by his lonesome after Valtteri caused a red flag in the rain, when the race eventually restarted after the formation lap, all 19 cars dived into the pits for slicks, and Lewis stayed out on inters on a now mostly dry track. This was of course the weekend Esteban claimed his first P1 in his F1 career. I'm keeping a very close eye on Mercedes to see what happens between now and the end of the season as to whether or not I think this theory is a fact or just a theory. Talking of Esteban came home in P6, which is a fantastic points haul for Alpine, coupled with Fernando's P3. Next up we have Sergio and Lando in P7 and P8. Sergio had a good race, but perhaps should have been able to score a few more points after only managing to qualify P5 and then finish P5. Lando had a good race, 19 points is a solid score for our Lando. I did mention in my last video we have a bit of a problem in my house with mini helmets. We have 6 in total, and today we received Lando's helmet from Miami where he looked like a basketball, which we ordered back in May. P9 was Esteban, P10 was Lance. In fantasy we have Alex and Seb, who both had really amazing races. Great points finishes for these two. 14 points for Alex, and that's on the higher end of his points tallies. And Seb pretty much nailing his season average with another 12 solid points. That's now 4 back-to-back double points scored for the 4-time world champion. In the race, P11 was Pierre and P12 was Alex. In fantasy, we have Carlos and then Lance, who scored another 11 points, meaning his run now extends to 15 consecutive races, where he has scored between 8 and 16 points. We often talk about George as Mr. Consistent, but Lance is the real Mr. Consistent. Carlos received a 5-second time penalty in real life, which dropped him down the classification to P8, and that was essentially mirrored and amplified, where Carlos received a 10-point penalty for losing 5 places in the race in fantasy after he qualified P3, so that put him down in P11 for the fantasy classification. Then we have Mick and Seb, and in fantasy we have Kevin and Pierre. Kevin actually outscored Mick this week because he made up places on his quali spot and Mick lost places. So with the rules of fantasy, on a weekend where Mick beat Kevin by 2 places in the race, he ended up losing out by 4 places in fantasy. Pierre unfortunately not really clocking any major points at the weekend. Going into Zandvoort, Pierre was coming off a 16-point mega haul at Spa, but after a disappointing race he scored just 6 points in the Netherlands, and there's not really anything more to say about it. Next up we have Kevin and Joe, and in fantasy we have Latifi and Joe. Look, every week there has to be winners and losers, and unfortunately now that we're down in the bottom 6, this is probably where the line needs to be drawn. 6 points for Latifi, 4 points for Joe. I think the only thing worth calling out here, which we will see on the teammate point deltas, is Joe is still closing the gap on Valtteri week after week. But as we'll come to in a second, that's mainly due to Valtteri's poor results, rather than Joe pulling any big points out of the bag. P17 was Daniel and P18 was Latifi. In fantasy, we have Mick in P17 and Daniel in P18. The poor run of form from Daniel continues, with him now scoring just 2 points in the last 4 races. And then last but not least, we have Valtteri in P19 and Yuki in P20. But in fantasy, these positions are actually reversed. So we have Valtteri now scoring back-to-back P20s, clocking in minus 18 points across Spa and Zandvoort, bringing his points tally for the last 6 races to minus 9. Valtteri's season really is a tale of 2 halves. So in the first 8 races, Valtteri scored 154 points. So his race average was just over 19 points per race. But since Azerbaijan, Valtteri has only managed to score an additional 7 points, which means his race average is currently 1 point per race. At this point, I think the safest thing to do is remove Valtteri from all of your teams and maybe reassess the situation in a few weeks. Jumping to the data for a minute before looking at the championship visualized, I think the thing to call out here is that Max is going into Monza looking to equal his run of 6 straight podiums in the fantasy classifications. Zandvoort was a 4th win in a row for the Dutchman, so he really is just in a league of his own at the moment. Lewis scored some really good points this weekend, which kind of makes you ask the question, what would have happened at Spa if he hadn't had his lap 1 incident with Fernando? And then down at the bottom, Yuki clocking another negative score means that now over the last 9 races, Yuki has scored minus 5 points. So if you take the opening race of the season at Bahrain and the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix out of the mix, Yuki has actually scored minus 3 points across 13 races. I don't know if anyone still has Yuki in their team, but if you do, please transfer him out. This is not Yuki's year, and the chance of him repeating his performance from Italy earlier this year in Italy this weekend seems extremely unlikely. Okay, jumping into the chart, Max's lead in the championship continues to grow, the gap now a potentially insurmountable 163 points. George is still in P2, his score from the weekend really helping him build a gap over Leclerc, who now finds himself trailing George by 26 points, and only leading Sergio by 31 and Lewis by 34. So the battle for P2 and P3 is still very much ongoing between these 4 drivers. Carlos is not a million miles off the pace, but for Carlos to get into the mix for even P3, he needs to close a gap of 74 points, which feels like a big ask in the final 7 races of the season. Further down the chart, the battle for the title of best of the rest is still raging on, with Fernando making a big move and closing the gap to Lando by 15 points. I wouldn't say it's an impossible ask for Seb and Lance, but with Seb on his 182 and Lance on his 176, which is just off the screen, because this is just the top 10, I'd say that they're moving towards being out of contention, unless they can do something big this weekend. I would say the battle for P7 has become a 3-horse race, with now just 29 points separating Lando, Esteban and Fernando. Looking at the teammate point deltas, I think the thing to call out here is that Aston Martin have now jumped ahead of Alfa Romeo in the standings. There's still just 6 points separating both Aston Martin drivers, so these two are still very much in the ring together, and I'd bet my last dollar that this battle rages on until the final checkered flag of the season is waved at Yas Marina. Fernando is so close to flipping Esteban. If you go back to Fernando's home race, there were 94 points separating these two after Spain. And now, 9 races later, Fernando has closed the gap to just 10 points. I'm not saying it will happen next week or even the week after, but by the end of the season, based on the current trends, Fernando is going to reverse this delta and build a healthy gap over his teammate. And for me, that's why Fernando has to be in everyone's team at the moment. Zhou is currently benefiting from Valtteri's bad luck, and this gap has now come down from triple to double digits. But then right next door, the exact opposite has happened. Pierre has now extended his lead over Yuki from double to triple digits, thanks to Yuki's negative score in Zandvoort. Kevin has also flipped Mick, but these two are just up and down in recent weeks, and I'd almost bet that in next week's video, Mick will have reclaimed the top spot, only to yield it again back to Kevin after Singapore. Picking between these two is very difficult at the moment, which is why I have opted to use some extra budget and bring Albon into my team so I don't have to make a difficult decision week to week. With Albon beating Latifi by another 8 points at the weekend, it kind of shows you this is a difficult decision you can avoid needing to make. On to the points per pound, and I said in my video on Saturday I was hoping Fernando was setting up a second podium this weekend, but back-to-back wins was not expected. A great result from the Spaniard, 2.7 points per million. Fernando is really showing the world what he is capable of at the moment. And as I said earlier, Fernando should really be in everybody's team at the moment. Affordable for almost every configuration, even affordable in a team which has Max and Red Bull. Fernando is the fantasy GOAT right now, and if you don't have him in your lineup, I question your sanity. Going into Monza, I am really hoping this trend continues, and I think a third win is perhaps too bold of an ask, but I'd love to see Fernando get a triple podium across the triple header, and going into the weekend is very much on the cards. George clocking his biggest score of the year means he claims P2 in this week's points per pound championship. For a second there, it looked like George might be heading out of the top 10, but his scores from Spa and Zandvoort have really cemented his spot. Not quite top of the table, Leclerc and Sergio are fighting for the top spot, but George is now comfortably back in the top 10 with a 2-point margin over Kevin, who has now clawed his way back into the rankings after losing out to his teammate Mick, who went on a mega run from Baku to Paul Ricard. Valtteri now dropping out of the top 10, so from leading the championship at Monza to P2 by Austria to P8 after Spa to now P11 just one race later. P1 to P11 in 6 races. Brutal. And down here at the bottom of the chart, Yuki, Daniel and Zhou not even looking like they will break double digits by the end of the season. If we jump into the chart, we can see 3 key battles. Charles and Sergio are fighting up here for P1, just 0.7 points separate these two giants of cost efficiency. P3 is then a very close scrap between Carlos and Max, and there's now just 0.3 points separating them. Max is really just brute forcing his way up the rankings at this point, because go back 8 races and I don't even think Max was on here, so for a driver that costs 30.4 million to be battling for P3 is insane. After the Max and Carlos battle, we then have a bit of a DRS train, which is currently being conducted by Lance. There are 2.6 points separating P1 and P4, and then there are 3.2 points separating P5 and P10. So as the chart kind of shows, it's a battle for the top spot, a battle for third, and then a bun fight for everything else. On to the constructors, and I don't think it's worth labouring for too long on the constructors this week. To be honest with you, the story the data tells very much aligns with our expectations, and the result for race 15 pretty much lines up with the fantasy standings after 14 races. Red Bull P1, Mercedes P2 and Ferrari P3, and that's both the race classification and the standings. That trend then continues for Alpine, Aston Martin and McLaren in P4, 5 and 6, and it's not until we get to Port Alpha that we see the trend is broken. Alpha have now clocked back-to-back P10s, and as a constructor they've only managed to score 11 points across the last 8 races, and that's driven primarily by Valtteri's misfortune. If we jump into the points per pound championship, Alpha have won 4 races this year, and they were P1 at Canada, but now 6 races later they're P8, and it looks like they'll be overtaken by McLaren at Monza. I said last week that McLaren and AlphaTauri were going to start scrapping to avoid being classified as the least cost efficient pick, but after McLaren's good result of the weekend, I would revise my previous statement and say it looks like it's going to be Battle of the Alphas. Shouts out to Williams for their 3rd win of the season. They're having a great time at the moment, and their score at the weekend was good enough to overtake Haas for P6 in the championship. Red Bull still out there at the top, the gap to Ferrari now 0.9 points. Okay, that just about does it for this video. Thank you for checking in with us again this week. Stay tuned this Saturday because my next video will be my picks for Monza based on this data. And for anyone that watched my video, we called out some really great transfers to consider. So hopefully you made some good points swing trading drivers, and we'll see if we can make it happen again this weekend. Thank you for taking 10 minutes out of your day to look at this with me. I hope you have a great day ahead, and I'll see you again very soon.